talk here, I was thinking, what should I do? So I wanted to discuss an ongoing research project that central banks are very interested in. Not only central banks in developing economies like India, but also developed countries as well. And the issue here is, and I'll get to this somewhere in the middle of my talk, but I want to give you some teasers before. The issue here is that in employment numbers, you have a lot of informal labor. So when you learn about monetary policy transmission, you move around ISLM and you get some interest rate goes up, output falls, whatever it is. In the textbooks, you're never really taught about the fact that there is a lot of informality in your labor force. So in this title, where we're saying, how do macroeconomists build a model, implications for monetary policy and employment, this is the particular dent we're trying to make. So what academics should do is build paradigms. That's what we do. So pushing the research frontier is about building paradigms. So there's nothing out there. We don't know how to think about informality in monetary policy. So we want to put forward a model so that that discussion starts. So then somebody puts forth the first model. And this is not the first model, by the way. There's a lot of work on this. But it's the first model of its kind for a country like India. So what macroeconomists do is, what research economists do is they, think and they put forward a model to think about things. And then people read it and somebody builds on it and then somebody else builds on it and the field moves. And our understanding of the issue gets better. So that's what we're going to try and do today, is we're going to try and understand how monetary policy is set, keeping informal labor in mind. But the exact policy issue for central banks is policy efficiency. Central banks may have to raise interest rates when they face inflation, right? They'll have to tighten monetary policy because they want to slow aggregate demand down. Does everybody understand that? Yes. Now, that is called demand management. But when they tighten the interest rate, what they want to minimize is the sacrifice ratio. How much output is lost? So the question is, if you have a lot of informal labor in your labor force, what happens to policy efficiency? Does policy efficiency get worse? Does it get better? And what we show, just to give you a nutshell, is that more formality in the economy. So if more people have regular salary jobs, like all the people sitting in the front row over here, hopefully, they get benefits, they are DA and all that. Policy efficiency gets better. In other words, when you have an inflation shock and monetary policy tightens, you have to reduce the real side, or the slack you create on the real side actually becomes less. So the sacrifice ratio gets better. That's the insight that we learn. Now, we want to understand why that happens. What's the particular mechanism for which that happens? So that's the rough area of this talk. It's about policy efficiency, it's about taking the employment numbers seriously, and it's about putting it together. Now, just a quick thing. So if you were to track India's unemployment rates, by the way, does anybody do this? Any of the students look at India's unemployment rates on a regular basis? What are the sources of this? Anybody? There's a periodic labor force survey, PLFS, started in what year? 2017. 17. Who said that? Raise your hand. Excellent. 17, 18. And what was the antecedent to that? What was the predecessor? The National Sample Survey had an unemployment thing piggybacked on it. That was happening with every major round. So you know that, right? In the 1950s, we started the National Sample Survey, Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, and we've had roughly 7 of them so far, right? But then this stopped in 2011, and PLFS has become the new HCES, the new Household Consumption Expenditure Survey. PLFS gives us people's employment status, and it uses UPSS, usual principal subsidiary status. So it asks you, for instance, in the last year, did you work more than 183 days? If you say you did, then you're characterized as regular. It'll say, did you work in the last 30 days? And if you did, but you didn't have employment outside of that, then you're going to get classified as casual. Or you could be an own account worker. An own account worker is somebody who just, runs a family enterprise but doesn't hire anybody outside of it. And that's the predominant form of self-employment in India, in both the farm sector and the non-farm sector. Okay, so I'll put these numbers up there. But given that, excuse me, this type of self-employment, own account workers, sorry, the pollution is, I'm sure all of you are experiencing this as well. So, given that own account workers are a predominant form of self-employment, and self-employment itself is a predominant form of employment, this notion of policy efficiency and monetary policy transmission is a well-founded question. I mean, I'm sure all of you appreciate that. Okay. So that's what we're going to do. So, okay, is this the first slide or? Let's go back. Oh, can I control that or will you control it?
Go back. Good.
Okay, so let's give a quick overview of the Indian economy. So macroeconomists look at kind of large picture things, big picture things. That makes it very exciting. So next, please. So this is carefully constructed Indian growth rates. Carefully constructed. Okay. Everything that has gone into this is a number in my head. How it's been deflated, what it was 30 years ago, it's in my head, I know it. It's carefully constructed Indian growth rates, and basically until about 2020, after 2011, we're hovering around 6.6% aggregate real GDP growth, which is a good performance. Okay, so now we have two proxies for output, right? There's a proxy on the supply side and there's a proxy on the demand side. So on the demand side, you add PFCE, GFCE, and gross capital formation and net exports. On the supply side, you calculate GVA of all the sectors. And in the textbooks that you have, they should add up, right? But do they add up? No. And what is that discrepancy called? It's a statistical discrepancy. And that statistical discrepancy, by the way, how do you get from GVA at basic prices to GDP? What do? You have product taxes, you have product subsidies, you take their difference, you add it to GVA, and you get GDP at market prices. GDP at market prices. Now, this difference is an issue. Difference is an issue partly because of the deflators we use to deflate product taxes and product subsidies. That's an issue. But, so this is GDP at market prices. We chug along very nicely. Then in COVID, we see this sharp drop. This is quarterly data. So it won at the worst thing between March and June, and then also in June and the July to September quarter, you saw this big drop. But then you see this huge rebound, right? Things started getting online and the restrictions became less. This was before Delta. Then, of course, in 2021, it became worse again. So we saw this dip. But after COVID, we've grown at about 7.35%. That would be one of the world's highest growth rates for a big economy. That's impressive. But going back to this issue of unemployment rates, you will find in India that the unemployment rates are very, very low. The published unemployment rates in India are very, very low. Right? Now, you've got to ask, does that accord with your sense of what you observe around you? It doesn't, right? So, why is that the case? Why is that unemployment rate so low? And the reason is because it's a very liberal definition. It's basically picking up anybody who's worked, let's say, for an hour is going to be slotted in one of those three types of. It's a very liberal definition. So what you actually have in developing countries, which surveys don't pick up, is underemployment. Underemployment is you're not working a full day, or relative to your work, you're not very productive. So because the surveys don't really pick up underemployment, you get very low measured unemployment rates. So that's one thing you have to worry about. So when you're talking about high GDP growth, and you're talking about low unemployment rates or high employment rates, it's because of this particular feature of how we do surveys. But anyway, growth is good, and even though this is happening at the expense of a lot of self-employment and a lot of underemployment, you must appreciate those things. Okay, next slide please. Now, real GDP has chugged along at a steady clip from 2001 all the way up to first quarter, that is. And this is 2000 and whatever the latest quarter, 2025, 26 this financial year. And what we see is this kind of straight increase and the trend, and this is something you probably don't know, but what you can do is for every time series, you can extract the trend out of the series and decompose the series between the seasonal component, the trend component, and the rest is called the cyclical component. Now when you extract the trend using the filter, GDP per capita is trending upwards, and the deviation between the actual and the trend is the cycle. So this is saying its cycle is better than the trend, and then we dip relative to this. So this is how you think about the business cycle, and this is an area called business cycle analysis, or just business cycles. So what macroeconomists looking at output are interested in, they're interested in trend growth, but they're also interested in properties of the business cycle. So what I'm going to do today is apply the thinking or tools of business cycles to employment data in India, and then talk about employment cycles, and ask whether these employment cycles on regular workers, on self workers, on casual workers correlate with the output cycle. So if the economy picks up, is there more regular workers being hired? Is there more self workers being hired? Is there more casual workers being hired? And how does that look across sectors of the economy? Okay, so that's one aspect. We'll get to that soon. Okay, so that's GDP next. But in PPP terms, we're fairly large. We're like one of the largest economies in the world. Right? Everybody understand what PPP is? Purchasing power parity. So you can do it at nominal exchange rates, you can do it at PPP. So we're a large economy. We're growing at a fast rate. So that's good, and we're slowly beginning to, overtake the former industrialized powerhouses and becoming bigger. Okay, next slide please. In terms of per capita though, we're low. Right? In terms of size, we're large, but in terms of per capita, we are lower. In fact, we're ranked somewhere like 120th in the world. And that's the more important measure. It's not so much this discussion about, if you want to be 5 trillion or so on. So that's important. But what's more important is this. You want a high per capita income, right? And we want to, by the way, I think at about $5,000 in nominal exchange rates or $6,000 in nominal exchange rates will reduce the worst forms of poverty, extreme forms of poverty. And getting there itself is a milestone. And so the discussion should really be about what pathway should we take to get to that particular level, right? Tell me the per capita income that reduces the worst forms of poverty, and then give me, that's what macroeconomists can do, is give you the pathways to get there. Should you have more investments in human capital? Should you have more investments in physical capital, and so on? Okay. Next slide, please. That is on growth. On inflation. Inflation has tumbled. Inflation has stumbled. Now, it's important that your economies have low inflation. Again, very carefully constructed data that we have done. Inflation has stumbled from the early 2010s to about where it's right now, and I don't know if you saw the most recent CPI reading because it comes out on the 12th. What was the most CPI reading, CPI headline inflation reading? Very close to 0%. Inflation has gone down. And by the way, in 2016, India implemented what? This is important for this talk. It implemented a monetary policy framework agreement that is called inflation targeting. And what is inflation targeting? Inflation targeting says that the central bank is going to keep inflation, headline inflation, at 4% plus minus 2%. That's what the central bank does. And that headline inflation is called a nominal anchor. And financial markets understand it, that the central bank is going to target it and keep inflation at 4%. So, if inflation ends up exceeding, like say 6%, what will the central bank do? What tool does the central bank have? It has an interest rate, one tool. It's a blunt instrument because it affects a lot of things. Is it going to tighten or is it going to loosen? If it goes up, it is going to tighten. Okay, it's going to tighten money supply, right? And it's going to tighten money, well, okay, first, good. Tighten policy is going to make the interest rate higher, but it's going to adjust the money supply to get that interest rate. So the money supply becomes endogenous in this process, in inflation targeting. Inflation is stable, so this is also good. It's a good macro performance. Growth is high, reasonably high. Per capita growth rates are low, but that's, everybody knows. And inflation is stable. Okay, next slide, please. But if you strip out the volatile components of inflation, which are food and fuel, that is called core inflation. What's happened to core inflation? It goes in these cycles, but also after COVID, it has also begun to tumble. And this is seen as the underlying trend of inflation. So if it is down, that means that the underlying trend of inflation is down. And what is that telling you about demand side performance of the economy if core inflation is down? Because this is you strip out the supply side, right? And what you have left is the demand side. So if demand side inflation is down, then what is that saying about aggregate demand in your economy? Is it weak or strong?
It should be strong.
If the core inflation is low, it should mean that it is weak because it's low. But if core inflation is high, then that means that the underlying trend inflation rates are high. That means demand side pressures are high. So core inflation is about 4.3% in the most recent MOSP release. But it has been going in these cycles, and it kind of has this thing. So this is the interesting debate in India is, what should the central bank target? Should it target headline inflation, which includes food and fuel, or should it target core inflation, which strips out food and fuel? Because if it targets headline inflation, it could be driven by a bad monsoon, it could be driven by all kinds of weather shocks, it could be driven by a productivity thing. So there are all kinds of influences on headline inflation when central banks target. Okay, so core inflation is also reasonably good. Next. And then this just breaks up total headline inflation between, it's again a carefully constructed graph from all of us. So the black line is the total thing, and the breakup is between core, and it is green is food, and it is fuel here. If it's negative, the fuel inflation is in deflation. It is negative. But what complicates inflation management? So the first thing I told you was understanding informal labor and putting it into the story. Other thing that contributes inflation management is this big food component. It's moving around a lot. Just visually you can see it's a big chunk of this thing over here. But its contribution has begun to, over time, become a little smaller. But food inflation complicates inflation management because it's a big side of total inflation. And I've done a lot of work on this now, thinking about how central banks should respond to food inflation. Again, this is something that came up on the MPC. I was on the MPC, and there was a lot of discussion about, oh, the food inflation rates have gone up, should we see through it, should we respond to it? And I kept thinking, we don't have frameworks, we don't have paradigms to think about this. So this started a whole research agenda on how central banks should respond to food inflation. So you see things out there, and you say, there's no work on it. So what do researchers do? Researchers write papers in that area, and then we get a sense of the initial thinking on something, and then it moves. Okay, next. So, inflation is low, growth rates are high, very good. But, we also, again, carefully constructed. We have public debt measures in India. General government is state plus center. Central government is the blue line. General government is state plus the center. And under COVID, it went up to about 90, and now it's begun to drop from the high 80s to kind of, I think, slightly below 80s. And this is all the way up to 2025. This is general government and central government debt. And when you think about, so this is the, your indebtedness in your economy, what would be the concern here from a macro standpoint? Where would you think your exchange rate would become more volatile, or do you think private investors will pull out their capital if you had high public debt? Does anybody think that? Or is it just a very high interest payment that you have to pay that maybe crowds out other forms of productive spending? That could be a thing, right? So we pay something like 3% of GDP on interest payments. That could be spent on infrastructure, on health, on education, on building more buildings in Daulatram College, a whole set of things. So, macroeconomists worry about public debt and the drivers of public debt. Okay, next. And then of course this is a carefully constructed, again you have to all this side stuff, so our stuff. This is carefully constructed interest payments as a percentage of revenue receipts, and interest payments to revenue receipts are about 25%. So 1 out of 4 rupees in revenue receipts is actually paid towards interest rates and existing debt. It's a huge amount. It's a huge amount, and it has to be budgeted, it has to be paid, it's part of your revenue expenditure, and it is all in your fiscal strategy here. Okay, next. So, good growth rates, tumbling inflation rates, high public debt, not a macro concern, so to say, high interest payments as a proportion of revenue receipts. So where does growth look going forward? Now, one concern is that households, which is basically you and me also, are saving less. These are household gross savings rates. The gross savings rate are households, firms, and the government. It's gross, right? Since 2008, the economy is saving less. This is a concern because savings fund investment and investment drives growth. So if you have a lower pool of savings in the economy, you have to finance that by running you borrow from abroad, which means you run a current account deficit, which means you run a current account deficit which needs to be financed. Okay, so this is one concern for India's growth rates going forward, is that total savings are beginning to decline. And these are India's investment rates, that's the black line, which is the solid line. So in the investment rates, you have fixed capital and you have capital, a total, right? The total includes a bunch of other things. It includes inventories, it includes valuables, and so on. But when you include the total and you take out the inventories and valuables, this black line takes out the inventory and valuables. The dashed, dotted black line is the total thing. You see it also dipping. So here is challenge number one. Is household savings rates are falling. That does not bode well for investment rates going forward. Does not bode well for growth rates going forward for India. It's a concern, okay, that macroeconomists need to worry about. Okay?
So,
yeah.
what about the stock and equities?
So there's been a lot of financialization of savings, and that's true. So people have moved away from household savings rates to financialization. That's true. But yes, but even then, the gross savings rate, which includes all of that, is beginning to fall. Yeah. So there's a composition happening, and then the gross is also falling. So this is a macro concern, and some other work, just to give you an example. We have a formal model of this where we show that in the end, what drives this hump in India is a combination of a few things. I don't want to get into this, but it's a combination of a few things, and one of them is informality. Okay. So again, a good example of everybody writing down models and saying, hey, this is wonderful, but where is the research that is explaining this dip? And that's that research that is needed. Again, driven by India's experience. And not only India's experience, next slide please, other countries as well. Look at China, far higher investments in savings rates, but with a massive dip. India's lower investment in savings rate, but with a massive dip. Other countries don't have it. So a lot of macro models that are written are trying to just depict this here. Everything is going on a straight line. But the exciting thing about working in a developing country and doing macro research on a developing country is that you see all these differences in how these economies perform. And the correct research is really, for our case, is trying to explain this, and these explanations are very different for what's driving it in China and what's driving it for India. Okay, next slide please. So to put all this together, what we've found is that over the last 40 years, well, 1980 to 2020 using something called CLEMS data, KLEMS, which is publicly available, you find that India's growth is essentially capital input investment driven. That is this gray chart over here. And the contribution of the labor input is relatively small. So average GDA growth proportion for the capital input is something close to 66%. The labor input is close to 31%. And what is left is this total factor productivity growth over here, which in some years it's negative, in some years it's positive. So you could have negative TFP growth and you could have positive TFP growth. But if there's a one sentence takeaway from this chart, the chart says that India's growth performance is an investment-driven growth story, and that's why that household savings decline is a concern. It's a concern. Okay? Next slide, please. And this is again looking at the ratio of gross fixed capital formation to GDP. It is also stalled from 2011 onwards. It's flat. It was growing as a proportion of GDP, and now it is flat. So investment as a share of GDP is increasing in lockstep with GDP, but it's not increasing at a faster rate compared to real GDP. Okay, next slide please. Okay, so this is the segue into the employment stuff. Then we took very careful, so we've got growth, we've got inflation, and then the third thing that macroeconomists really worry about is employment. I'm not talking about the external stuff in this talk, it's all domestic economy. When we look at the breakup of employment, the biggest chunk is self-employed, close to 53%. In 1980, self-employment was 59% and now it is 53%. Regular workforce was about 13% and has now gone up to 24%. And casual was something like 29 or 28% and has gone down to 23%. Casual plus self is equals to about 76% of total employment. So this is the graph that I want to use to motivate the talk now. The talk is about how do you set monetary policy with this type of structural feature in your labor market. Okay? So this is casual over here, and this is self over here, and this is regular employment. Which sector of the economy has a very high proportion of casual labor? All of you live in a house? Yes? Everybody live in a house? Raise your hand if you live in a house. Okay? What sector makes your house? Construction. 70% of the construction sector is casual. So, the economy is releasing people out of agriculture and they're essentially going into informal services. Now, construction is technically I think it's included in the manufacturing sector, but in the service, it could also be included in the service sector. But casual is huge in construction, but the point I want to emphasize here is that the regular part is a minuscule thing compared to casual itself. The biggest bars are actually adding this on. So we want to take this data seriously. Okay, next slide please. But regular formal workers compared to other workers are also slowly beginning to increase. You see more formal workers compared to other workers. Again, this is very carefully constructed. No one has done this, I think. But from 1991 to 2016, this is now close to 30%. So every like 10 workers, 3 workers are in the regular workforce, which is encouraging. It indicates increased formalization, but with a caveat. If you look at the PLFS, you will ask people if they have regular work, but you will also ask them if they have contracts. And many people with regular work don't have contracts. Some of them may be sitting in the front row over here. They're hired, but the principal says, look, we'll keep you for a year, you're an adjunct, and then see you later. Okay, so there are lots of people who have regular work. You maybe finish your BCom, you have to do an internship, you join a CA firm, and they just basically make you work there. And you don't get a contract, because that's part of your experience. So there are many regular workers who, because when the survey comes and picks you up, the survey says, what were you doing? And you say, well, for 183 days, I was in some job, right? So you're regular, but you don't have a contract. Now, the question is, if you are that type, are you informal or are you formal? but you don't have any benefits. So technically, if you don't have any benefits, you are informal. So if you add the regular workers without contracts to self and casual, the proportion of informality is 90%. It's crazy, right? You're talking about 8% growth, but with this type of labor force, it is mind-boggling. As, by the way, Robert Lucas said, once you start thinking about growth, you can't think about anything else. It's very true. It is very true. Once it just gets lodged in your head, it's just impossible to think about anything else. But this is the employment dimension of it. So we're formalizing more, but we have this very large self and casual employment. So this is the point of this talk, is how do macroeconomists build a model? So we see this data, just take these last two graphs, and we want to address this issue of policy efficiency. Reserve Bank of India was interested in this question. They say, use the best data that we have available and just give us a paradigm on how to think about it. So the Reserve Bank of India commissioned a study, I led it. There were 5 people who were co-opted. I think 4 of them were in the Reserve Bank itself. And we worked over this for about 2-3 years, and we produced the following analysis. And this is a specific topic, but it is also a general topic on how macroeconomists build a model. And some of the confusion you may have in your head is when you learn macros, you get caught up in the school of thought, you know, classical, new Keynesian, new Marxist, new this, new that, and you're like, what should I do? But what you're going to see today is kind of like science. There's going to be data, there's going to be a model, then we will fit the model with data and then say whether the model is good or bad. And then understand the mechanisms in the model. That's how we want to think about things, in a very disciplined way. Okay, next slide please. So, hope you got excited. Great area to be in, Indian macro. So I hope some of you will end up embracing this field. And so it's a field of study that uses modern, quantitative, structural models. Structural models just means that you are looking at the structure and taking the structure of the economy seriously. Okay? You're not writing like 2 equations and saying this is the economy. Taking the structure of the economy seriously, micro-founding every entity that is optimizing, then you're adding stuff up, aggregating, and that's your aggregate economy. It's micro-founded. It is bottom up. It is not top down. That's what a rigorous macro model is. The structure is essentially saying we have these structural features of our development, of our economy that need to be incorporated into the model. Okay? So, and then the question we're going to ask that is relevant to policy is, what role do central banks and the government have in promoting growth? That's a broad question, but this is the broad field of Indian macro, and I work in this area. Okay, next question. Next slide, please. So let's get to what the hallmarks of a good applied macro model are. So there are 4 components to building a model. When you start off building a macro model and you have a research question, the first thing is you need empirical analysis, you need stylized facts, you need to understand measurement. If you are working on employment data, you should understand the PLFS, you should understand the consumer pyramids, household surveys, CPHS, you should understand ASUS. Does everybody know what ASUS is? It is now a quarterly data of unincorporated manufacturing and service sector enterprises, which has about 450,000 units, and this is an enterprise, so you have household surveys and you have enterprise surveys, right? So another lacuna in the Indian data landscape is that PLFS gives you your employment type, but we don't have the demand for labor coming from the enterprise. Like how many vacancies have they posted? How many jobs did they hire? And so on. You have it a little bit in the hired worker question, but this is an issue with the enterprise survey. So the first thing is measurement. The second thing is, once you get a sense of the facts, you say, here's a theory to explain these facts. The third thing is estimation, calibration, and some simulation. And the fourth thing is model validation. So for those of you who are interested in pursuing macroeconomic research, make sure you are up to speed with your maths, make sure you are up to speed with your econometrics, make sure all your professors here are teaching you all the right stuff. And third, make sure you're up to speed with coding. There's a lot of coding in macroeconomics. Either you can do it in Python, or you can do it in MATLAB, or you can do it in the free version of Octave. But that's why many people who go on to do PhDs in macroeconomics drop, because they have to learn all three things. It's not just theory, sorry. Good applied macro work goes through all these bullets. And all these bullets require you to have skills. You need coding skills, you need econometric skills, and you need math skills to write down models. So the fixed costs of becoming a macroeconomist are higher. But once you learn all this stuff and you survive, then you just feel empowered to write amazingly nice papers which are useful to society. Okay? So these are the 4 bullets here. And I have some references here. You may have seen Eric Sims's notes. Anybody seen this name here? It's a great set of lecture notes on intermediate macroeconomics. This is a bit advanced. Christian Wolff is at MIT, has a very good course syllabus. You may want to take a look at that. And then, of course, there's some references here for calibration and estimation and impulse response. RF. By the way, I'll show these to you. Impulse response functionality. Okay, next slide, please.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah.
What do you mean by stylized facts?
Yeah, you'll see in a second. Those are the facts that you're trying to explain. You have large data sets, and you're trying to summarize all the information in those data sets in terms of some facts. And you're trying to get the model to explain those facts.
Are there certain parameters involved?
We're estimating some regularities about the data.
Okay.
That's the fact. Okay, and then we're going to ask, this policy efficiency question. We're going to ask how formality matters, and then this is just that it's based on joint work, and I'll just say that everything mentioned here is not attributable to the Reserve Bank of India or the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, so it's just my views and our views on this particular paper. Okay, next. So, step 1. What are the facts, employment facts? Okay? Next. Here are the facts. So, what we see is, this is output using GVA. Everybody understand GVA? GVA is a bit more accurate than GDP. So this is the cyclical part of GVA. So the blue line is the cyclical part of GVA, and the orange line is the cyclical part of regular employment. So you log it, you take it through a filter called a CF filter, Cristiano-Fitzgerald filter. You can do it in R or you can do it in Stata, and you extract the cyclical part of the series. And what you see is this, is when GVA goes up, the regular cycle also goes up. In other words, there's more regular employment cyclically when GVA is moving cyclically. And it more or less overlaps very well. But the relationship between casual is less. In fact, when it's high, casual employment cycles are lower. When it picks up, GVA cycles are lower. So for casual employment, you would expect the coal movement to be negative. For regular employment, you would expect the coal movement to be positive. Self-employment, which is this thing here, is a catch-all variable, right? So if you're not here or here, you're typically here. And I just said self-employment has, in the farm sector and non-farm sector, a large proportion of this type of employment is own-account workers or own-account enterprises. Those are small family firms that, like somebody in the village may start a shop outside. That would be an own-account enterprise because you don't hire anybody outside of the family to run it. The self-employment cycle has no statistical bearing compared to the GVA cycle. Your decision to start a shop, it doesn't matter whether the economy is growing at 7%. You just start the shop. It's a local condition, it's a household decision, and you do it. Okay, next slide please. So, your question about what is the fact? Here's the fact that we get from Indian employment data. We get that GVA correlates highly with regular employment. You saw the cycles like piggyback on each other. Casual employment is negative. In other words, when the economy picks up, measured by GVA, casual employment goes down. Negatively correlated. And self-employment is negative, but it is insignificant statistically. So this has no bearing, the cycle has no bearing on the decision to self-employ, and this is positive and this is negative. And these coal movements are just negative and they're positive, and there's a lot of autocorrelation. Everybody understand what autocorrelation is? Correlation between the current value and the previous value. A lot of persistence. In other words, if you had high regular employment, you're likely to have high regular employment tomorrow. And if you had high casual employment, you're likely to have high casual employment tomorrow. So this is fact number one, is that GDA in employment is positive and negative. Now, a preliminary theory is, one second, preliminary explanation may be is that when the economy picks up, firms seem to demand more regular workers, salaried workers, and then they get rid of the casual workers. And when the economy slows down, they end up first taking casual workers, and then, right, because that's a negative correlation, and they're getting rid of the regular workers. That may be a preliminary way to think about this. There's a question, yeah.
So if self-employment is a very big part of employment,
Yeah.
why is it insignificant? It must have some impact, at least given it makes, we can't keep it as cash or factors because it's a major chunk of our employment.
It is statistically insignificant, even if it's a large part of it.
So it is a very large part of our employment does not even affect GDA.
A very large if employment is not influenced by GDP. So if the, yeah, and that's partly because the type of self-employment in India are not startups. The type of self-employment in India is like a distress unit that is being set up to supplement your casual income.
So it is not a very large part of employment chunk. Self-employment makes a big part.
It makes a big part, but it is not correlated with the cycle in any systematic way.
It does not impact.
It is not. Not impacted, it is not correlated.
It is not correlated.
It is not correlated. Not correlated, yeah.
By correlation, you mean it's indifferent?
Simple
factors
correlation.
like Inflation.
No correlation between the GDA cycle. This is just a correlation between the GDA cycle and the self-employment cycle. That's it. Get that number, and find the correlation. Okay, next slide please. I'm at 5 to 12. I'm going slow, right? Okay. Now, what happens if you take out agriculture? Take out agriculture and just restrict to the modern sector, which is services plus manufacturing. Minus construction. So this is the second lesson I'm going to tell you today. First lesson is, when you model India, put the US textbook aside, look at the data and form your theory based on the data. Appreciate that. You have to explain what you see in the data. Lesson number one. Lesson number two. When you just confine your analysis to the modern sector, again, the modern sector goal moves on regular, it is negative on casual, and again you're going to see the same thing. This is just self-employment in the modern sector. Next slide please. What you see here is, again you get the casual employment to be negatively correlated. You get the regular employment to be positively correlated, self-employment to be insignificantly correlated. Same result holds for the modern sector. But this is the modern sector excluding construction. What if you add construction where there's a lot of casual workers? Now you would think when the economy picks up, what's the first thing people want to do? Buy a house, build a house. And if they're going to build a house, the construction company is going to hire casual workers. That's going to be pro-cyclical, right? So the question is, does that overturn the modern sector result, minus construction? So if you just click on this thing over here, possible to do that? Just take your mouse and click this. Here's what you get. It gets reversed. Sorry, correlation. It gets reversed. From a negative, it becomes positive. Highly positive. So, lesson number two. Not only look at the data in your country before you form a model, understand the sector. Macroeconomics is not about an aggregate analysis where you don't look at the underlying data. You have to look at what's happening at every sector, because this sector is overturning this aggregate result. So now, the modeler is faced with this issue. Which fact should you explain? Should you write down a model that explains the economy without construction? Or should you write down a model which explains the economy with construction? So we say we'll explain the economy with construction because it's part of the modern sector. But I want you to appreciate, and if any of you aspire to become chief economist at some point down the line, and I hope some of you do become it, you have to really understand what's happening inside the sector in terms of data very carefully. Because you can't say something in the aggregate and then have something like this reverse it. Okay? So the sectoral perspective matters. Okay, let's go back. And these are just some numbers saying that there's a big chunk of casual employment in the construction sector. Yeah, true. You'll have to just, yeah. Back, all the way back, yeah. Yeah, okay. So this is modern sector. Next. Okay, so that was the stylized facts. Now, I can't explain the econometrics here. Now we're asking this question. How does the decision by the central bank affect these employment outcomes? And how does it affect the informal employment outcomes? Right? Everybody understand the question? So what we found was, there are these financial instruments called overnight index swaps. Okay? Financial institutions use overnight index swaps to hedge their interest rate risk. So there are 30-day overnight index swaps. So on day 1, I make some deal, and on day 30, the payout needs to be made based on the index that is moving around during this period. Now, on the day of the policy, you may have agreed to some rate, but the policy may have surprised both parties. And the swap rate became different. The payouts became different. So we're going to use that surprise on the day of the policy for a 30-day OIS swap as the exogenous change in the monetary policy stance. Because remember, monetary policy is responding to the economy. So we just can't use the interest rate. There's an endogeneity problem there. You have to use the exogenous component of monetary policy. And right now what's happening in monetary policy research is a lot of work now is about, this is called causal identification, about pinning down the exact effect. Causal identification uses high frequency data in financial markets to proxy for the exogenous component of monetary policy. So we use that, and what we find is that when central banks tighten the rate, the 90-day T-bill rate rises, the 10-year G-Sec rate rises. This is complicated. The economy actually first picks up, but then it goes down. Self and casual employment go down, but it's insignificant in the middle, and then it goes down. Regular employment also kind of goes down, and then the economy disinflates. This is like, part of this is chapter 5, 6, 7 in Blanchard, the textbook that you know, but you don't appreciate this when you write down these ISM curves. Look what's happening here. For about 15 months, the surprise actually raises GDP. It raises GDP. Monetary conditions have become tighter, but that actually stimulates GDP. And then the decline begins to happen. Okay, so those numbers that I put up before, and these are called impulse response functions, form the basis of a theory. We want a model which, when we simulate, gives us decline in self-employment, declines in regular employment, gives us some decline in output, and disinflates the economy. Okay? Yeah, next slide. Let's finish up. So here's the model. So then we have to sit down and crack our brains and use whatever. So I'll just very quickly just tell you that there's a field in labor called search and matching. Now, when you think of unemployment and employment in the Blanchard world, you have a price setting equation, you have a wage setting employment, and then you have the natural rate of unemployment, right? Everybody remember that? You get the natural rate of unemployment, then you write down an AS curve, which is P in terms of PE and 1 plus mu and all that stuff, right? Okay, I know this book inside out, so you do too. And then you move it to inflation and you get some Phillips curve. Okay, that's the supply side of the economy. The aggregate demand side of the economy is it the IS curve or is it something else? It's not the IS curve. You have to substitute the interest rate back into the IS curve to get the aggregate demand. So the model we have is not this. The model we have is that there are a pool of unemployed people looking for jobs and there are a pool of formal workers looking for jobs. And the formal guys are also applying to the public sector. So you may take a competitive exam after this, right? And the formal guys cannot look for jobs in the informal sector, or maybe they don't want to. And the informal guys cannot look for jobs in the formal sector. This is called search and matching. Now firms in each of these sectors post jobs. They post vacancies. And those vacancies are matched with an unemployed worker with some probability. And the wage that is decided when the match is made is based on Nash bargaining. Nash bargaining means the match creates an economic rent and both sides bargain for that rent based on their bargaining weights. And the outside option for the household, because they may get a great IAS job, influences the wage that the firm is going to give. Makes sense, right? Outside option's great, that means you may actually also leave the private sector job. So this is called search and matching, and I think about 20 years ago, a group of people got the Nobel Prize for writing down search and matching models, which are now very much part of macro models. So what we did in this project was we integrated a search and matching model with informal employment into a macro model with monetary policy. That was the approach we had to understand those IRFs. And what we assume here is that the casual firms also post vacancies. If you're a construction firm, how does it work? Do you actually post a vacancy if you want to hire workers for some skyscraper coming up on the Greater Noida Highway? Probably not. You have a ठेकेदार. The ठेकेदार says, मैं आपको 1000 लोग यहाँ पे ले आऊँगा कल, and I will get it done, and that's how it's going to get done. Again, great scope for work. Understanding those networks, understanding how those job postings work, and so on. So we thought that was a little too complicated. So we said, well, there's some openings in the construction sector, and the firm is either through the contractor or by itself getting the word out and filling it. And that job opening is being filled. But the key thing is that the labor market is dual. You can't move across both of those guys. So this is what this whole thing says. And next slide, please. And just here, this is where some maths comes in. Fee, the final output, which is what you consume, is based on a bunch of intermediate good firms who are producing formal varieties and informal varieties. And fee is a proportion of formal intermediate good firms. 1 minus fee is the proportion of informal intermediate good firms. Total GDP Y is produced based on inputs that it buys from the formal good variety firms, indexed by I, and the informal good variety firms, indexed by J. These are just their elasticities, and this is also an elasticity, elasticity of substitution. The formal guys, so then, lesson number 3. Now the words are over, right? Now what economists have to do is, okay, everybody says, wonderful story, you've totally got us hooked, informality in monetary policy is hot, great, go ahead. Now, what do? Well, this is where the maths comes in. Now you have to start writing down the model. And it's hard, but it's beautiful. It's wonderful to do it. So then you say, well, maybe the way it works is that formal guys hire private formal workers, and they have access to physical capital. Informal guys, firms, who produce these varieties that makes final GDP, only hire self and casual workers. So if you are a casual firm, and you're a casual worker and you get matched, your outside option is self-employment. If you don't get the construction job, you're going to go home and open up that shop. If you're a formal guy, your outside option is the public sector. If you don't get a match, then you can always go and apply to the IAS and get in. It's very easy. If not the IAS, then IES or IRS or one of the gazetted services. That's the theory. The theory is, you look for the outside option when you're searching for the job. Okay, next slide, please.
So in formal firm, we don't have the capital.
Formal firms have capital, informal firms don't have access to capital. Now, you can say, well, that's not true. Informal firms also have capital. Again, those are all details, but we just want to keep things in a tractable way because, and again, I don't want to scare you now, but in this process where unemployed people are looking for jobs, formal firms are posting vacancies, informal firms are posting vacancies, there's some probability with which these matches are being made, and then any firm that posts a vacancy is bargaining over the rents that are going to be created in terms of the wage it's going to set through national wage bargaining. All this is going on, and then the central bank is setting monetary policy and they're taking that into account. Now you crank through this model, it's like 67 equations, and what you get for the equation that gives you inflation, remember I said earlier on, the task is to see if policy efficiency improves with more formalization, and I said yes it does. So now this fee parameter, which was the proxy for formality, enters into, this is inflation by the way, this is pi. So now this doesn't look like Blanchard chapter 6 anymore, right? And you wouldn't expect it to. You wouldn't expect it to because the story is much more complicated. But inflation in the model, and by the way, this is called a new Keynesian Phillips curve. Phillips curve is just a relationship between inflation and a gap variable. It can be a wage gap, it can be an output gap, it can be an unemployment gap. This is a new Keynesian. It's new because it's based on micro foundations. It's based on explicit optimization. And the point is that the actual inflation rate, pi, is based on pi t plus 1. People's expectations of tomorrow's inflation is going to determine inflation today. Insight number 3 or 4, I can't remember. Edmund Phelps, who won the Nobel Prize, said that if you want to control inflation, you have to control inflationary expectations. It appears on the right hand side. Central bank has to keep this low to keep this low. Because this is determining this. That's why central banks communicate and measure inflationary expectations in many, many ways. And they always make statements about, the governor will always make statements about managing inflationary expectations. It all comes from here, from the new Keynesian Phillips curve. Okay? But the point I want to impress upon you is that in this complicated model, phi appears. Higher phi is actually going to lead to lower pi. You can just check that. If this goes up, there's a minus here, this falls. If this goes up, this denominator goes down. This whole thing explodes. There's a minus thing here. Actual inflation is going to fall. And then these other things start appearing here. The wage that you're going to give the self-employed person who's going to appear is going to determine inflation. Output and consumption. So can you see that now the structural features, this is the ratio of self to casual employment, this is the wage given to the self-employed guy, this is the terms of trade, this is the price of the informal good relative to the price of the formal good. All these features are going to, are going to impact actual inflation. Why? So now we've got a theory of how inflation is going to evolve. Okay, next slide please. And let's wrap up. So this is the calibration part. I won't have time to run through this. Excuse me. But what we get is, no, I won't worry. What we get is, now we have to put some numbers, right? Remember we had these impulse response functions before? We go through the literature, we estimated a lot of the stuff ourselves, we borrowed some parameters from the literature, so we, remember, all those equations have parameters, and we have to have values for those parameters to run it. So we borrow from the literature, we estimate many things. This is the calibration part, part 3 of building a macroeconomic model. Slide please. Next slide. So it's a long, laborious exercise, and this is difficult, but once you get your parameters, and this is the validation part, the model and the data are matched very well, which means you're on the right track. You're able to get these things, like the wage premium from the data that I showed you, the standard deviation of core inflation, all this stuff here, correlations, to match very, very well. And so we target these variables, get these parameters, and then we have some other variables which we don't do very well at, but reasonably. But this is what is important. So this is the model validation. So now that the model is replicating those key things in the data reasonably well, we can simulate it. That's step 4. So when we simulate it, let's go next. You want to understand how, again, informal outcomes are determined. So this is, again, there's a little bit of game theory. I know the people in front are teaching game theory. But in Nash wage bargaining, the private wage that a worker is going to get is going to depend on various terms. Okay? And one of the terms comes from the indifference curve. Everybody understand an indifference curve? There's CT and CT plus 1. If you have a lot of CT, what's your marginal rate of substitution? You have a lot of CT. Are you willing to give up a lot of CT to get 1 unit of consumption tomorrow? Yes. MRS is high. So the MRS actually ends up becoming beta CT over CT plus 1. This is log utility. So this is U prime of CT plus 1 over U prime of CT. That is 1 over CT plus 1 over 1 over CT. So you get this. But the wage rate is based on all these different things. And this is the highest officer payoff over here. If you have a high wage, right, you're likely to exit, and if you're likely to exit, the firm is going to basically say, maybe we won't really. Now, here's what I said before, is that maybe it'll give you a higher wage, but in the model it ends up becoming negative, and it says, maybe if they're going to leave, then we should actually give them a lower wage. Through Nash wage bargaining, we get this thing, and if you go to the next thing, in the informal sector, what happens is monetary policy tightens, aggregate demand falls, demand for the informal input falls by firms, and self-employment demand, casual employment demand falls, so these employment outcomes fall. This happens to this equation. Next slide, please. And I'll just wrap up. So, as in the data, this is what we find. We find that monetary policy here, when it tightens, leads to a decline in consumption. Okay. And it leads to a decline in consumption, it leads to a decline in inflation, it leads to a decline in output. And it leads to, next slide please, a decline in formal sector output, a decline in investment, leads to a decline in casual employment, leads to a decline in informal labor market tightness, it leads to a decline in the casual wage. Decline is where you are relative to 0. So if it's here, you're in the negative thing, so the impact effect leads to decline in private sector formal employment. Next slide, please. Isn't this exciting? It's kind of telling you how the economy operates. And then self-employment falls, employment of this thing falls, informal falls. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, move on. Now, we raise formality in the economy. This is the policy efficiency result that we just had. The dashed line is what we had with the new increase in formality. And the blue line is what the original baseline was. What we find is that the dashed line is higher. And this is the policy efficiency result. When the central bank raises its rate, output falls by less. Consumption falls, but by less. Inflation actually falls by more. You can't see it. Next slide, please. Private formal employment falls by less. Output in the formal sector falls by a little bit less. The capital stock falls by less. So, you get the same reduction in inflation. If you go back to the previous slide, not the next slide, you get the same result in inflation, but at the expense of, next slide, the forward slide, much, previous slide, lesser real economy outcomes. Policy efficiency increases. So the message we give to the central bank is, here's how transmission happens, this is how wages are set in the economy, and this is how policy efficiency gets better. Next slide. Okay, keep going. So that's what we do. So this is a class of models called New Keynesian DSGE. You should know this because this is like cutting edge stuff. I mean, this whole line of work. DSGE stands for Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium. And I've put forward a New Keynesian, which means that there's some price stickiness. I've put forward a New Keynesian DSGE model, with the labor market characterized by search and matching frictions, which I explained, and with informal employment, to address issues of policy efficiency and monetary policy transmission. And what we find is that formalization leads to more policy efficiency, and we get a better sense of how this transmission works. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you. So remember, when you give policy advice, lesson number 5 or 6, I can't remember. When you give policy advice, don't write a newspaper editorial. Do the hard work, run it through, do the 4 years of hard training, and then give your policy recommendation. Always has to be backed up by some analysis. Because we're now living in the, as someone told me, the university of WhatsApp world, right? Everything is like WhatsApp. Every morning we get like 40 different views. But you've got to discipline yourself to hard analysis when you make policy recommendations. So if you end up, and I hope many of you do, become macroeconomists, interested in policy questions, then make sure you invest the time in learning these tools to do justice. Yeah.
Everybody has more doubts. Please raise your hands and we can.
Yes, please.
Since the Phillips curve actually trade off between the unemployment and the inflation, and especially since the Phillips curve actually trade off between unemployment and inflation, and especially in weak economies like India, does we have any other model, macroeconomic model, which actually teaches us like how do we actually curb down the unemployment without actually raising the inflation? And if it's not there, then why do we still study the Phillips curve a la US model?
So the Phillips curve, by definition, is just a relationship between some proxy for inflation on the left-hand side and a gap variable on the right-hand side. The gap variable can be an output gap. The gap variable can be an unemployment gap. It can be any gap variable, right? Now, if it becomes flatter, or if it becomes steeper, what does a flat Phillips curve mean? That to get a particular reduction in inflation, you need to create a lot of unemployment. You need to create a lot of slack, right? And that could be happening because of lots of different structural reasons in your economy, right? Now, that doesn't mean that a flat Phillips curve is not useful for policy. But what it does mean is that the output sacrifice is becoming larger. And that's something you have to understand what's driving that. Because that has a real world implication, right? Having to lay off workers and so on. So a flat Phillips curve doesn't necessarily mean that the Phillips curve is wrong. It just means that you have to explain why the output sacrifice has become larger. So the advantage of doing structural work is that you actually get a specific equation. And therefore you get a particular slope of this thing. The slope is this thing you're talking about, the flatness of the steepness. You get a particular slope. And that slope is given by different variables and different parameters. So your model will tell you, because after all the story is based on your model. We're not talking about some other like global condition like oil. The model will tell you, you go to the slope component, look at what variables are in it, and the model will tell you what is driving that flatness or steepness. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes?
Now understand that formalization is better for policy effectiveness.
Yes.
So should the future policy focus be on increasing formalization or developing something out of which addresses, because informal is a great part of the economy right now.
Did you say great?
Like,
By great you mean a big part.
Big part
Yeah.
of the
Not
economy.
as a value statement, but
So
it's a big part, absolutely.
should
But,
the
yeah.
policy focus be on
Policy
increasing
focus.
formalization or
No, policy focus should be on formalize the economy. Formalize the economy is a good goal anyway. Formalizing an economy is a good goal anyway. You want everybody to have salary at their regular jobs, like all of you will, hopefully. But it also adds to policy efficiency. It makes the central bank's job easier. They're able to disinflate by less sacrifice, output sacrifices.
when the chunk of the informal unemployment is too high and when we want to formalize it, like
It's just the extension of that. That when we have like a lot of informalization and we wish to formalize it because we find that our policies are more effective in that kind of an economy, should we not trade off in the unemployment in the like short run probably, because there are a lot of people dependent on informal unemployment. So if I immediately formalize my economy, don't you think that there's going to be a structural unemployment that's going to come?
Could be that if you immediately formalize, it could be that the guys who have informal jobs may be out of jobs. Maybe that's your question. However, the desire to push formal employment should not stop because of that. Either you should have unemployment insurance or a welfare state scheme that transitions to that state. But you want to push the formal employment vigorously. Everybody wants a regular job. We should give it. That should be a development goal. It should be a paradigm, right? We should be working towards that. But what is the way that the economy works? So if you have a choice between formal and informal workers, and suppose demand is picking up, the economy is growing at 8%, right? So now formal firms will start to meet this demand, start hiring informal workers. Now the informal workers are going to be low wage, they're going to be low productivity. So the low wage means that they can hire all this cheap labor, produce that demand, and inflation won't really rise because they're low wage. So the cost of the firm has not risen. So informality gives you a flexibility or a margin of adjustment to meet this demand. But it comes at the expense of low productivity, because now you're hiring lower productive workers into your thing. So that's the benefit of having informality, kind of picking up on the spirit of your question, that you're able to meet the demand, but it comes at the expense of lower productivity. Right? But having said that, whether welfare is going up or now, I mean, but this is the point that, you'll end up hiring those informal guys, so that's good. We'll give them jobs, at least it'll be low-wage jobs, we'll give them jobs. But that's not to take away from the argument that you should formalize and put in place systems where you can have, and this is going to become a major issue. By the way, the next 30 years, the big kind of risk hitting us is what? Apart from this, is climate. It is going to be climate. And you want to think of Pareto policies that are Pareto, where, everybody benefits, right? And what that design should be in policy for Pareto set of policies. So, yeah, so to answer your question, formalization is important as a goal in itself, but it also helps with monetary policy to do its job.
Making changes to the expectations, say in your T+1, will
Coming back now a little bit. So.
making changes to the expectation, as you said, say in time period T+1, will have its implications in the subsequent years. So I didn't really get the part where you said that it can actually determine the way expectations change in the current time period.
Okay, very good question. It's a good question, and it's a good confusion, because she hasn't seen the model that tells you why future inflation is going to affect current inflation. Not from the firm side. The firm is making decisions now about what price to set. And the firm is forward-looking. So it's going to face marginal costs of production in all future periods. Now, when it faces marginal costs of production in all future periods, it has to decide what price to set. So it's going to set in these models as monopolistic competition a price that is a markup over a marginal cost. So these future pricing decisions, which are going to determine inflation now, is going to be based on future marginal cost realizations. So that's why that forward-looking term comes in. Because that's going to determine future inflation. That allows them to incorporate all that and set the price that we have. Sorry. I hope all of you wear masks. I don't, which is why I've gotten this.
Good afternoon.
Last question or? Go ahead.
Yeah. So whenever we are talking about employment and unemployment, currently one more thing that is very much in trend that we talk alongside is AI and how it is
Is what? Is what?
AI.
AI.
Artificial intelligence.
Complicated.
And how it is, day by day we get new surveys and new data, how it is impacting the employment rate around the world. India, which is already facing employment crisis, like what do you think, what models or modifications should we have in the policies and strategies to move forward, because India have a big human resource, and AI will, because of its efficiency and productivity, will obviously impact that. Also, do you think that another public opinion is that AI is people are overestimating it, and in long run it will not have that much impact? Do you agree with it?
It's going to have an impact. First of all, that's your second question. Now, how would, by the way, this is again a great area to work in. How is an AI going to impact our labor force? So, an economy produces products. When you start off and you're poor, you produce t-shirts. Then you move to maybe a feature phone. Then you move to a semiconductor chip. As you move up the sophistication of the product you produce, the tasks associated with producing those products become different. What is the task you need to produce a t-shirt? Nothing. Class 5 pass, you sit there on the thing, move the clutch, and you get your t-shirt made. For a feature phone, you need to have some skill. For a semiconductor chip, you need to have more skills. So what's going to happen with AI is the task set is going to get different. And if the task set is going to get different, the skilling that is required to produce those tasks is going to become different. The skills required to produce a t-shirt is different from the skills required to produce a semiconductor chip. So where national planning should be focused on is providing the population with these skills to anticipate the types of services and products that the economy is going to produce in the 21st century. We're no longer going to be producing goods, well, we will be producing some goods like food and so on, but we're going to be producing very different goods. That's going to require very different tasks, and those tasks are going to have to be backed up by very different skills. So what this means for education policy and for human capital accumulation is that it's going to require skilling, reskilling, and lifelong learning. And to answer your question is that it is going to take away some of the routinized jobs. Yeah, it is going to do it, but there are some uniquely human attributes like creativity and emotional intelligence that maybe AI can't do. I don't know about in the future. But AI can't do that will protect that kind of work. But for all the jobs, the routinized jobs that have minimal cognitive content that it will replace, it will also create jobs to manage those products that deal with AI. So the issue on the employment is whether AI is going to be a complement or a substitute. Now, for a country like India, which enjoyed very high BPO sector growth, IT and ITES, that is something that AI is just going to swamp. It'll just take it over. It's already doing it. So that stuff has lower cognitive content and it's easily routinizable, and AI can take over it. But the more specialized stuff with slightly higher cognitive content will be something that is presumably protected. But the skilling needs to happen, looking forward on the tasks required to produce different products needs to happen. All that is going to be crucial to long-run growth and employment outcomes. It's scary, but it's also exciting. We have to rack our brains on this one. Yeah. Anybody else?
That will be the last question if there is any.
I just have a small question. You just mentioned about savings rate falling in the recent years.
Yeah.
So, informality is the main reason for that, or is there any other reason? I'm just trying to figure that out because informality was there earlier as well.